Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here today giving the introduction of a topic that is very close to my heart, that is circular economy. And I must say that I really enjoy reading the biographies of our speakers today and selecting what I was going to talk about it. And I have to share some things that were told to me, and then I want to share some things that were not initially in the biography from all of them, but I had a chance to talk a little bit with them and get a little bit more of not just the academic side of things, because we want to know who is going to be talking here. I know that Dave is going to do a good job getting a lot from them, but to give a different perspective for us to understand them, and for some colleagues that I know for so many years and I didn't know the musical taste. So first, I wanted to say that we talk so much about achieving net zero and how we reduce carbon emissions, and we have targets UK 2050, Scotland 2045. How can we do that? But there is no way that we're going to achieve anything if we don't think in a transition to a functioning circular economy. How is that possible? And how this is possible in so many different areas that require this transition. With that in mind, it's great to see that Heriot-Watt has been investing in talent for a number of years, that even before it became fashionable, the term circular economy, we're already looking at that and developing circular approaches in different fields. Today, we have experts leading fields that are quite different, but at the same time, so complementary. And I'm going to start talking here with Professor Marylyn Carrigan, that the first one on the table there, that is a professor in marketing and sustainability at the Edinburgh Business School, that joined us in February 2022. Marylyn was Director of Research at Keele Business School and an academic at universities of Birmingham and Strathclyde with a vast experience with research expertise that covers a wide range of subjects that are so important moving forward for us to be able to have a more sustainable future that considers areas of ethical and sustainable consumption, consumer behavior, small business social responsibility, as well as circular economy. And very important, together with the research, is to know a bit more about our speakers today, and I wanted to know a bit about their musical tastes. So I asked Marylyn what kind of music she likes. And she said that she has a quite broad taste for music, but she will say classic 80s Glaswegian music will be the focus of her selection, her playlist, and her favorite band is Everything About the Girl. I think we could go out dancing together, definitely. And I have to say that there is a trend that is not the first introduction to these professorships that I give that end up the conversation in music. But Ed Sweeney, in your biography, I was very impressed because you spoke about music already there. And thank you for that, because I didn't have to ask you. I was very happy to hear and read your interesting musical taste and how much you have been supporting arts in a more broad way. And it's a pleasure to also introduce Ed Sweeney, that's a professor of logistics and supply chain management and the head of the operations management and logistics group at the Edinburgh Business School. He was head of Aston University Department of Engineering, Systems and Supply Chain Management from its establishment until July 2020 that we had the pleasure to have Ed joining us here in Heriot-Watt. He is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transporters, the Chartered Institute of Management, and the Institute of Leadership and Management. Ed research goes from operations management, quality, logistics, transport, and supply chain systems. And I'm delighted to share that he has interest in classical and opera music, as well as theater and poetry, and is a member of the Royal Society of Arts, that a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, supporting arts in a more broad way. That's fantastic. And then it comes Nick, the last speaker, that I know Nick for many years because we started working Heriot-Watt in 2006, and we were, I think, in the first core of PG Cup together. So he was my classmate. So it's fantastic to see that we started together as a lecturer, and Nick, before coming to Heriot-Watt, have been working in UCL and in industry, then joined Heriot-Watt and became a professor in August 2016. Nick is a professor in bioprocessing and is also the chief technical officer of Horizon Proteins, that is a spin-out company from Heriot-Watt. And he's going to be talking more about that later. That is very exciting to see, from a lab idea to create something that is real and is happening and is so relevant, and with a very circular approach in the real world. His research expertise go from novel separation methods, process development, scale-up, and sustainable bioprocessing. He's also chair of the Scottish Bioeconomy Council. And music-wise, changing a bit the area, but as important, he said that grunge is what he enjoys the most, but, and I can understand that, lately he's listening Olivia Rodrigo, that is his daughter's favorite. And it's very important to see that there is democracy in your house and your daughter chooses the music.
Benign dictatorship.
So thank you very much for everyone to join us today. Pleasure to see more initiatives like this happening here in Heriot-Watt in very timely and important topics like circular economy. And I'll pass the microphone to David, that is going to take much more from them moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much there to Professor Gabby Mediro for doing much of my job. The one thing she did forget to mention was that Ed is going to deliver his presentation entirely as an operatic performance, just to mix things up a little bit today. So my name's David Lee. I'm just simply here to guide us through proceedings today and ask a few questions at the end. It's a pleasure to be involved in my third lecture panel as part of the Inaugural Impact Programme series. I've also been involved in doing 2 podcasts, and what we're really trying to do at Heriot-Watt is to show the impact of the work of all the new professors, but to do so in a range of different media, a range of different ways, just to reflect the way that everyone's consuming information in different ways in 2023. Just a couple of boring housekeeping points. The fire exits are here and here. Reassuringly, you can see daylight from these fire exits, which is not always common in a university. So straight outside, if there is a fire alarm, none are planned. The toilets, if you need them, are out and to the right, and there will be further refreshments served afterwards in the room out and to the left after proceedings are finished today. So what we're going to do, we're going to hear for about 15 minutes each from each of our professors around their specific expertise. As Gabby said, it's very interesting that it's a very diverse range of contributions, but at the same time very complementary. And we'll be asking some questions. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of our three professors around the theme of how achievable is sustainability through a circular economy. So first of all, can you please join me in welcoming Marylyn Carrigan, who's Professor of Marketing and Sustainability at Edinburgh Business School. Over to you, Marylyn.
Sorry, this is being very stubborn. There we go. So first of all, hello and thank you everyone for showing up, especially some of the friendly faces who I didn't realise were going to be here as well. I want to start by giving you, I don't want to start by doing that. I want to start by going right back to this one. Hold on. Yeah, so I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of background on who I am. So thank you to Gabby for doing that. But I want you to maybe understand why I'm here talking about this topic. I'm a working class professor from Ayrshire, and that's something I feel very proud about, but it's something that's always informed and guided my research as well. Over the years, I've worked with all sorts of organisations and lots of industries as well, and shared my research in many different forums. A few years back, I had the privilege of working with the jewellery industry, and as a result of that, presented my research on corporate social responsibility at the UN OECD Joint Forum on Responsible Mineral Supply Chains, which was all about conflict minerals in that industry. And also, as a result of that, got invited to Moscow to the industry's World Jewellery Conference, which was a really interesting gig. I've had an installation with colleagues in the Blue Zone of COP26, which was highlighting fast fashion supply chains. But sort of latterly, I really tend to support small communities to engage with sustainable consumption. So most recently, I've been working with the Grab Trust charity in Oban and Helensburgh. And that was on a UKRI and BSA funded waste-free takeaway trial to try and encourage locals and tourists to choose refillable coffee cups. So my research focuses mainly on ethical and sustainable consumption. It's something that I've been studying for about 30 years. In the 90s, there was a conversation building around this idea of the ethical consumer. Consumers who would boycott organisations that were irresponsible and be willing to buy and perhaps pay more for products from companies that treated their stakeholders with respect and followed ethical and green business principles. Now, I decided to do some exploratory research to gauge, well, just how much was that true? Because if it was, then this was really going to be quite transformational for marketing. And the article that came out of that study has turned out, and I had no idea then, so I'd say that to all the PhD students out there, you never know how it's all going to go. It was a seminal paper in the field, and it was really the first paper to talk about the ethical consumer. And this article's had lots of attention. It's had almost 3,000 citations. It's been downloaded 183,000 times since 2005. But what's interesting about that paper is that the central message from the findings has remained a conundrum for many years. And that's how elusive the ethical consumer seems to be. And we were curious to know, could we really believe there was a significant group of consumers out there willing to make changes in their lifestyles and spend their money more responsibly? And if so, what issues did they care about? What motivates them to shop ethically? Because that was and still is the big question for businesses. Could they take the chance of changing their business model from the dominant social paradigm, one that prioritises this notion that the earth has limitless resources for humans to support their progress? And if businesses did become more ethical, would consumers repay them with custom and loyalty? Now, research suggests that the lived experience of being a sustainable consumer is expressed in lots of different ways and meanings. It's complex, sometimes flexible, and sometimes really unpredictable. And the research has consistently revealed that while consumers express sustainable concerns, they cannot always be relied upon to act upon those concerns, which is often talked about as the attitude-behaviour gap. And people practice sustainable consumption by expressing their values in what they buy, or sometimes what they avoid, and often making choices that they believe benefit the community or the environment, so such as avoiding red meat or choosing plastic-free products. But this is far from straightforward, and people often have to make, sorry, I'm going to try and move that along. People often have to make coping choices to simplify and manage the number of options we face when we're trying to be sustainable. And there's many inherent tensions that go along with trying to be sustainable. So a few years ago, we did some research in St Ives studying local food chains. And there's a huge amount of sustainable food activity in that town. Tourists are highly supportive of the businesses that source locally, farm and fish sustainably, forage ingredients and focus on seasonable produce. However, several of the participants highlighted the dilemma that St Ives faces. It's a town of only 12,000 people, but has 1.5 million visitors each year, and the town simply can't cope. So while these visitors keep the sustainable food, fishing and farming businesses going, peak tourism is causing huge environmental damage, pricing locals out of the housing market and make it hard for workers to actually be based there. And as one of our participants said, yep, the town was built as a fishing town. It wasn't really built for the modern day. The ideal sustainable tourism for Cornwall is to send the money and we'll send you some pictures of the holiday you would have had, and just don't bother coming. So what should we do? Should we visit St Ives and keep the food tourism alive? Or should we avoid it and reduce the environmental damage that we cause? Although extensively studied and critiqued, there's a little consensus on what causes that tension between what we say we care about and what we actually do about sustainability. And some suggest that the sheer breadth and the complexity of sustainable consumption requires too many convoluted trade-offs for people, so they just give up. A good example would be how difficult people find it to decide what to place in their different recycling bins. Can you recycle soft plastic? Are receipts recyclable among the paper? Heads up, they're not. We end up carrying out wish cycling, and that's something we encountered in Oban. Many of the cafes in our reusable cup trial had chosen to use vegware single-use cups. Now, those are compostable. So the cafe owners believe that if we're still going to use single-use cups, and we have to, for the time being, then these are the best choice. However, the cups can't be composted in home composters. They need to go into an industrial composter, and Argyll and Bute don't have one. So all the cups were going into landfill and incineration, and despite all the added costs that the cafe owners were paying, it simply didn't make any sustainable difference. So like the cafe owners, most consumers lack that necessary ethical literacy to make informed sustainable choices. Now, traditionally, much of the sustainable consumption literature has been framed in terms of consumers' needs and wants. So focusing on encouraging people to make purchases that are fair trade, free range, organic, low carbon, shop local. And this kind of sustainable consumer is popular with mainstream business because, of course, the consumer's still purchasing. But increasingly, there's more awareness that what we need to do is actually stop our unsustainable levels of consumption, regardless of how ethical or sustainable it might be, because we're still using resources. Because after all, a landfill full of organic t-shirts is still a landfill full of t-shirts. And even the circular economy requires resources to be used to repurpose and recycle material and goods. So given these challenges, what defines a sustainable consumer is moving towards a focus on consumers who are trying to consume less or consume minimally and avoid waste. And researchers are also starting to question the agency of the sustainable consumer to actually make a difference in a market that's so driven by consumption. Oh, sorry. This is a very sensitive clicker, Nick. So, the increasing use of qualitative studies in consumer search, such as mine, has revealed much more complicated explanations for people's actions and why this attitude behaviour gap exists. Sociological perspectives are gaining traction in our understanding of the sustainable consumer and focusing less on this kind of ideal that we had of this cognitive, rational decision-making. So, for example, some research is putting more emphasis on cultural backgrounds, people's personal histories and the social context that we shop in, while other approaches are looking at sustainable consumption as identity work or as habits and practices and routines. And we recently published a paper studying the transference between generations and its role in facilitating family food sustainability. Now, most food socialization research has focused on early years learning, but we found that intergenerational transferences are significant in shaping sustainable and unsustainable consumption throughout life. And secondary socialization can play a critical role in modifying early behaviour patterns of food socialization, breaking those formative habits and prioritising sustainable behaviours. So part of the reason for the myth of the ethical or sustainable consumer is that what we've been trying to do is find simple answers to what are actually really complex complex problems. And we have to recognise that human psychology isn't simplistic, tastes are not stable, people are neither fully rational or completely selfish, and inconsistencies can be seen as coherent if we actually consider sustainable consumption as part of people's multiple identities and life projects. And the more we study consumption, the more we recognise that it's embedded in these relationships of obligation, rather than a simple, rational, individual and autonomous behaviour. Decisions that we make are made as members of households, we're parts of families, we have workplaces, we have social networks, and we're part of communities. And people can only consume what's available, what they can actually afford, or what's actually accessible. And I use this picture of a West End house there in Glasgow where they've got their electric car plugged in over the pavement in a non-designated parking spot. And it just sort of highlights just how difficult, having an electric vehicle can be. This is determined to play up. So, progressive businesses are beginning to incorporate some of the alternative business models that used to only exist in community or small-scale organisations. And what we're doing is we're exploring new ways of consuming, access-based consumption, things like sharing or pooling or renting or borrowing, or liquid consumption that favours experiences rather than products. But some of these alternative grassroots business models are also entering mainstream marketing. In Glasgow, ACS have been operating a circular economy model since 1997, when they began renting kilts. ACS take care of the entire reverse logistics process for clothing firms such as French Connection and Nudie Jeans, enabling brands and retailers to join the circular economy. And while we're seeing more sales of ethical and green products, traditional business models still dominate our narrative, and the wider marketplace doesn't necessarily acknowledge or count these activities. It tends to perceive them, a bit alternative and inconsequential. And this clouds the evidence that sustainable consumers exist in any significant numbers. Yet alternative consumption spaces reduce and rebalance consumption more responsibly, and they challenge that throughput of excess consumption and waste. Now, while we need new technology to help consumers perform sustainable consumption, these initiatives also require greater structural change, along with progressive policy to support and help encourage sustainable consumption choices. Recent examples of this include what's been happening in Sweden, where in 2017 tax cuts were introduced on repairs to bikes and shoes and clothing. And just this year, France announced a €154 million repair fund, where people will receive a direct subsidy of anything between €6 and €25 towards the repair of an unlimited amount of damaged clothes and shoes. Being a sustainable consumer usually requires some kind of effort. Everything from committing to washing out your plastic containers and putting them in the correct bin to carrying around your reusable cup. And overlooking the importance of the disposal side of our consumption has made consumers unaware of the consequences of their action. In our recent I should move that one on, it's on there. Okay. In our recent paper on bereavement inheritance, which I'm sure lots of you have had to deal with, we highlight how for too long we've overly focused on the acquisition side of sustainability and not enough on disposal. And using liminal theory, we found that the way in which inherited goods are held onto or let go during that bereavement process has actually got implications for sustainability. So some people, overwhelmed by the emotions and the sheer volume of their relative stuff, simply sent it to skips and landfills. Others were focused on ensuring it was repurposed, upcycled, or passed on. And the journey that the participants and the goods went on during bereavement was providing opportunities to steer more responsible and fulfilling future consumption, with an emphasis on limits rather than excess. And many of our participants talked about reducing their own consumption or living less cluttered lives, so there was not so much for their families to clear out. So to conclude, the circular economy as an approach to tackle waste is gaining traction, but it comes with a health warning, as some circularity can be worse for the environment. It's still encouraging more consumption and throughput of goods. It removes any consumer guilt or responsibility from unnecessary purchases. It can often require workers to repair, separate, and recycle vast quantities of sometimes toxic waste. And it relies on efficient capture at disposal stage, which we know just from the single-use cup example is not always successful. So for the circular economy to be effective, we need thorough life cycle analysis. And while circularity does offer some potential advantages, we have to guard against overstating the efficacy of this approach unless it's properly managed across the life cycle. It's often challenging to scale up local movements like reusable cups or zero waste, so we might just have to accept that some sustainable choices will only be available in certain sectors or communities, at least for now. And too often we've taken rational responses at face value and neglected that emotional, symbolic and social meaning in our consumption. And that's made us underestimate the need to disrupt habits and how complicated those changes would be. So future research needs to focus on what matters to people and accept that some things will have only local rather than global potential. Even so, collectively, that could be transformative. And driving sustainable consumption through better technology, efficiency and design is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So wherever possible, we need to discourage that throughput of stuff and focus less on the front-end acquisition and more on how we use, dispose and discard what we have. And in the words of the late, great Vivienne Westwood, buy less, choose well, make it last. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed to Marylyn there. Loads to think about and hopefully quite a few questions. No receipts in the recycling, who knew? Yeah, I texted home while you were going there. I'll now hand over to Ed Sweeney, who is Deputy Executive Dean in the School of Social Sciences and a Professor of Logistics and Supply Chain Management. And Ed is going to give us a supply chain perspective on this whole question of sustainability and the circular economy. Ed.
Can you hear me okay if I step away from the microphone? Excellent. I tend to move around quite a bit, so apologies for that. This is our question for today. How achievable is sustainability through a circular economy? And what I want to do is to give a supply chain perspective on this. And what I propose to do with my agenda is I've got three main areas. First of all, I recognize that in this room we have very few of us who are experts in supply chain management and logistics. So please bear with me while I give you a brief introduction to this fascinating subject. So I'll ask the question, what is supply chain management and logistics and why is it important? Now, once we do that, I'll move quickly on to the second topic, where what I want to do is I want to look at some of the key sort of mega challenges that we face in the supply chain in 2023. And I want to spend most time on the last piece because it's easy to stand here and talk about problems and challenges. What it's much more difficult to do, but much more interesting to do, is to talk about ways forward and talk about possible solutions. And in the context of my final agenda item, what I'll try to do is to bring in examples of some of my recent and current research, which is squarely aimed at trying to address some of these challenges and to develop, at least to contribute to the development of some of the solutions. So going back to basics, whoops, you were absolutely right. You were absolutely right. We've got to go back. Sorry about that. So that's your classic textbook representation of a supply chain. So what it says is that a product reaches the final consumer on the right-hand side through a chain of organizations, a chain of companies. So the supply chain is that chain of companies. And the chain will typically comprise suppliers, processors, distributors, retailers, and so on. So there's a couple of things to say about that. For example, if this were a food supply chain, the source would be a farm, probably. The consumer might be myself eating my lunch using a fork. So we often talk about from the farm to the fork, for example, with food supply chains. You'll also see the various arrows that we've got. So we've got the product or the service moving from left to right. We've got funds or money moving from the consumer back down the supply chain, and we've got information flow in both directions. Now, the thing I wanted to point out about that is that it looks very, very linear to me. There's very little about that model which is circular. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later on. The other thing is, we talk about supply chains. And I don't like this word chain in this context, because the reality is most so-called supply chains are large, complex networks or webs of organizations, not a series of linear dyads, right? So we have a lot of complexity. Most real supply chains will be networks that comprise hundreds, or in some cases, even thousands of different separate independent entities. The reason the supply chain terminology has stuck, I think, is because if I can get on to the next one, this is difficult. This is difficult, absolutely. I think what I might do is just move back over here and do it the old-fashioned way, right? So I'll be moving even more than I plan to. So I think the reason the supply chain terminology has survived for as long as it has, and the phrase supply chain management was first used, we think, back in 1982, so over 40 years ago, is that we think about the concept of the chain being only as strong as its weakest link. And that's an important concept. So really what we're saying is that unless, as an individual organization, we have the right companies to work with, and indeed the right relationships with those organizations, upstream and downstream, my individual organization can never really achieve its true competitive potential. And that's quite a profound thought if you think about it, because what it's saying is that it's not companies that compete with other companies, it's actually supply chains that compete with other supply chains. And that knocks a lot of the conventional wisdom, for example, about strategy formulation on its head. Now, the other way of thinking about a supply chain, and I will do it the traditional way, is if we think about a product supply chain for sure, the supply chain involves at least 5 key things. We buy stuff, we make stuff, we store stuff, we move stuff, and we sell stuff. And what we find is that in a lot of traditionally managed organizations, these different processes or functions were often measured very much in isolation from each other. And because they were measured in isolation from each other, they ended up being managed in isolation from each other and often operated at cross purposes. So in many ways, what we're trying to do with contemporary supply chain management is we're trying to move away from that kind of scenario, which is characterized by high levels of fragmentation, and move much more towards an approach which is characterized by integration. So contemporary supply chain management really is about trying to integrate these different processes and functions, and it tries to do that through the effective and holistic management of these various flow systems. Again, we have the flow of materials and money and information. So that's, with due apologies, almost a textbook introduction to what supply chain management is about. And of course, the other question we can raise is, well, what is logistics as part of that? Look, there's a widely cited definition of the word logistics. It comes from the main North American professional body in our field, which is the Council for Supply Chain Management Professionals. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I won't read it all out, but I've highlighted the 2 words which are perhaps most important, and that's the word flow of goods and the word storage of goods. So if you go back to the previous slide, we talked about buying stuff, making stuff, storing stuff, moving stuff and selling stuff. Logistics is really about the movement and the storage part of that. Now, that's what it's all about, but why is it important? Well, it's important for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, if we think about logistics and transport here in the UK, even using a narrow definition, that sector employs over 2.7 million people, and employment growth forecasts between now and 2035 come to about 30%, which is much higher than we see in most sectors. So a significant employer of people throughout the UK and internationally. In terms of economic contribution, transport and logistics contributes about 163 billion to GVA. That's about 12% of the total economy. But it's important to remember that logistics and supply chain activities don't just happen within logistics and transport companies. I mean, logistics and supply chain activities are crucial to the success of retail organizations, to manufacturers, and indeed to companies across all sectors. And the final point really is that the reason this is important is because supply chain management and logistics, these things are crucial, not just to economic well-being, but to societal well-being. You know, the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, we take it for granted, but they all reach us through one of these supply chains. These supply chains have to be designed and implemented and planned and operated on a day-to-day basis. So that's why it's important. Now, let me move on quickly to the second part of my presentation, mega challenges. I've tried to come up with the list of the biggest challenges which we see in the supply chain profession. This is an invidious, probably an impossible task, but I've tried to narrow it down to 6 that we see across different sectors and across different geographies. The first is competition. You know, we have hyper competition, intense competition. We have increasingly sophisticated markets with very discerning customers who want more and more in terms of service and more in terms of quality, with downward pressure as a consequence of competition on prices. And alongside that, of course, we have an inflationary environment where we have cost pressures. And in the logistics sector, the 2 biggest costs that companies have are fuel costs and labor costs, and they have risen rapidly in the last couple of years for reasons with which we'll all be familiar. We've got rapidly developing technology. That's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge, particularly for smaller organizations who really struggle to simply keep abreast of developments in technology and what those developments mean potentially for them. We've got a massive talent shortage. Some of you will have read about the serious shortage of HGV drivers, for example, and that was particularly acute in the post-Brexit period. But that's just the tip of the iceberg in a sense, because we've got well-documented talent shortages right across the supply chain. And we have a major government-backed initiative called Generation Logistics, which is beginning to make some inroads into addressing that particular challenge. We learned huge amounts about supply chains during the pandemic, most of all about the need for resilience. Our focus historically was always on cost reduction and customer satisfaction, not so much on resilience. Bounce back ability is my definition of resilience. We also need to remember that most supply chains are global these days, notwithstanding our discussion about de-risking supply chains and de-globalization. We still see supply chains which are very international in complexion and sometimes genuinely global in complexion. And that's probably the biggest single change I've seen in my career since I left university in the 1980s. What that means is that our businesses are very subject to the volatility which exists in international politics, international business, and international economics. So that's a big challenge we're all trying to grapple with. And finally, and I've left the most important one to the end in many ways, we know very well that supply chain activities, including but not limited to freight, transport, and logistics, do damage to the natural environment in the form of pollution, but most importantly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and the contribution that makes to what the Secretary General of the UN now calls global boiling. Not global warming or global heating anymore, it's boiling. So we've got all of these things together. It's a classic example of the so-called VUCA environment. We're trying to cope with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity simultaneously. Any one of these challenges would be difficult to grapple with on its own, but trying to grapple with all of them simultaneously is not easy. Now let me move on to the last part, and let's be a bit more positive. And really what I'm going to say is that the addressing in a practical sense of these challenges is fundamentally about how can we take on board and put into practice many of the well-established principles of contemporary supply chain management, of sustainable logistics, including a lot of what we've learned over the last 20 years about circularity and the circular economy. So there's an interesting article a couple of years back in the Harvard Business Review. You can see it here by colleagues from Cambridge University. And they said, that the title is Circular Supply Chains Are More Sustainable. Yeah, we would expect that. However, they're not very common. And the question they raised was, well, why are these circular supply chains so relatively rare? And that raises questions about many of the practical blockages and many of the practical barriers that exist to the implementation of these concepts. So a lot of my research over the last number of years and currently has been about, let's identify some of these barriers and let's try to think of practical ways of addressing them. The first one, and I'm going to mention just 5 here, the first one is about complexity. In many supply chains, we have probably excessive complexity. And the last book I put together, what I did was brought together lots of international experts on logistics in a global context and really got them to try to understand what are the big challenges that we're facing in terms of unpicking complexity. And a lot of what we're trying to do is to, where possible, replace excessive complexity with relative simplicity. A big strength here at Heriot-Watt in our Centre for Logistics and Sustainability is very much on the mathematical modelling of complex supply chain architectures. So it's about building particularly agent-based models with a view to helping us to understand the dynamics and the complexity of those supply chains. And the logic is that unless and until we can really get a handle on what the dynamics of these supply chains are, including the complexity, we can't really begin to develop effective interventions to improve sustainability and to enhance circularity. Secondly, I think it's probably fair to say that supply chain management historically has often been regarded as a set of tools and techniques aimed principally at trying to improve operational performance and to reduce operational costs. And I disagree with that. I mean, I think supply chain thinking in the 21st century is very strategic. And a paper which I led on about 5 years ago in IJOPM was very much about strategic level adoption of these ideas. So it's really about asking the question, how can we leverage the supply chain and how can we leverage logistics as a source of competitive advantage? So you can see it shifting the dial away from a purely operational towards a much more strategic approach. I think in business, logistics and supply chain management has gone from being almost a loading bay function to being a boardroom activity. So that's a practical manifestation of some of these changes that we see. Number 3, none of this will work without effective collaboration. So it's collaboration between public and private sector. It's collaboration between us as academics and the private sector. I think in a supply chain context, given that we've got hundreds or thousands of companies in supply chains, it's about how different companies up and down the supply chain can more effectively engage with each other. And the last paper I was involved in working on before I came to Heriot-Watt a couple of years ago, when I was still at Aston, we coined this idea of environmental alignment. So it's looking at 2 of the key sort of players in any supply chain. That's the logistics service providers, the freight transport companies, if you will, and their customers, we call the shippers. So that's manufacturers and retailers. And it's looking really at what we can do to better align their perspectives to achieve higher levels of collaboration. And there's widespread recognition, I think, that if we are to achieve the deep cuts that we need in greenhouse gas emissions from freight logistics, that will be dependent on highly effective collaboration and alignment, particularly between these 2 groups of organizations. The other thing that's massively important is the people dimension. I'm an engineer by training and by background and probably by instinct. Don't hold that against me. Somebody said to me recently, Ed, you're a recovering engineer. My role in the School of Social Sciences now is very much about staffing and people, and I love it. Because the one thing I've learned in the last 25 years is that supply chains are many things, but first and foremost, they're about people, And interestingly, in the academic research, the people dimension, the human chain, if you will, is often sadly neglected. And another paper I was involved with a couple of years ago, building on a book chapter I did ages ago, which was kind of a thought piece really, was looking at the human chain in logistics and supply chain management. And incidentally, that reminds me of the inaugural lecture I did down at Aston University some years back. And the title of that lecture was a cultural perspective on logistics and supply chain management. And a lot of that cultural perspective was about the people dimension. But I refused the offer of singing operatic arias in explaining this. And finally, my very last point is that if we are to succeed with all of this, we need to be much more holistic than we have been in the past. In the past, we've often been very piecemeal. I couldn't resist this, but just last week, I got acceptance of this paper after several rounds of reviews and resubmits. It's in the International Journal of Logistics Management, and it's about the use of mixed methods in research. And, you know, my strong sense is that if we are to really understand the complexity, if we are to be more strategic and to understand the collaborative and people dimensions, our logistics and supply chain research needs to be much more comprehensive. It itself needs to be more holistic and needs to make much more effective use of mixed methods of data collection and analysis. And I hope that paper gives people some guidance in terms of how to do that. Thank you. I'm going to sit back down and look forward to the Q&A session in a while. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Ed. And again, lots of food for thought, lots of questions there. Finally, we're going to hear from Professor Nick Willoughby, who, as Gabby said earlier, is Professor of Sustainable Bioprocessing. And, well, you can see his title on the screen, so I won't repeat it. Nick, over to you.
Right, thanks very much. And I'm going to start off with a couple of apologies. First to Ed and Marylyn for apparently deliberately sabotaging their talks by providing them with a clicker, which appears to have a mind of its own. So I'm now going to attempt to use it and see if it works for me. And the second one is, I'm an engineer. It means I'm very simplistic. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to put up on this and talk about today, you're probably going to look at it and go, that's really obvious, I knew that already. But hopefully it might offer a little bit of a different perspective on how we look at things, particularly around the ideas of manufacturing. I am a biochemical engineer. Broadly, that means I started off as a chemical engineer and developed a pathological hatred for differential equations and discovered that if you work with biological systems, they tend to operate at like room temperature and pressure, and you don't have to do difficult maths. Very good. I started off in protein therapeutics. My background, my commercial background and startups originally were manufacturing therapeutic drugs. I became a little bit disillusioned with that kind of therapeutic space and became more interested in protein as a resource generally, which is how I came up here, and I've ended up working in sort of sustainability. So let's see what happens if I do this. See, one was okay. So we'll start off with some sort of perhaps bad news, negative stuff. I think it should be pretty obvious to everyone in the room that if we don't change how we operate as a species, we've got a major issue, okay? We cannot continue as we are and expect to achieve net zero or beyond zero or sustainability, or indeed, you know, a kind of sustainable planet. We need to change how we look at things. My interest is in how we change how we look at manufacturing things. To do that, it's not something that certainly can be achieved by academics alone. It requires, obviously, innovation. It requires money. It requires political buy-in. It requires societal buy-in for changes that we make to what we do. The concern I have in this space is about a tendency for all of us to siloize what we do. So academics, yes, we are driven by the need to do cutting-edge science, or the desire to do cutting-edge science to make change things, but we need to understand and be pragmatic about the buy-in that's necessary politically and the buy-in that's necessary from people to make the kind of changes that we want to do. From the perspective of manufacturing, okay, you can't just go, right, this is manufacturing and pigeonhole it all into one thing. It's intrinsically linked in almost everything we do. So many products are manufactured. While I'm talking about manufacture as a whole, my interest is primarily around the spaces of actually food and drink a lot of the time, and byproducts and things associated with that. But you see from this diagram up here, so many things feed into stuff, so many things overlap. Both speakers so far have made it eloquently clear that this is very complicated and very difficult and very challenging, but there are things that can be done. All right, let's start off with things that we are good at. All these things are lifted from a website called Speed and Scale. It's quite, these are a wee bit out of date. They've probably changed a little bit now, but the context won't have done. Speed and Scale looks at where we are making progress and how far we have to go around decarbonisation, around sustainability and things like that. And again, this might be obvious to everyone in the room, but the areas where we make progress are all share common properties, okay? They're spaces with consistent infrastructure and where we don't need to change much. We make progress in power generation because everybody in this room doesn't care whether the electrons that charge their phone came from a green source or from burning dead dinosaurs. It doesn't matter to how we live, right? We can make changes certainly in personal transportation because it's not much of a personal sacrifice to move between something that burns oil or burns a biofuel or runs on electricity. Okay, all right, yeah, maybe we have to adapt how we drive and how we charge our cars, but these things can be changed, okay? But more, we make progress in areas where governments financially incentivize. Governments financially incentivize green power generation, green fuels. They don't necessarily properly incentivize green manufacture in other spaces, and I'll come to why in a second. We love innovation. We are a brilliant country in general for funding innovation, but we're terrible at funding it where it then has to cross into manufacturing. I'm not going to say we gave up being a manufacturing economy a while ago, but we are looking at a situation now where we need to fund and support a new generation of manufacturing industries. And everybody, this is coming from the perspective of somebody who has spun a company out and been through this, all large-scale infrastructure investors want to be the second person to fund something. They don't want to be the first person to fund the first plant that does X or the first plant that does Y. Other countries can do it. Norway's really good at it. Benelux region is pretty good at this kind of space. We are not, and we need to sort that out. But the big challenge I want to talk about is, or part of what I want to talk about is, the difficult carbon to decarbonise. Carbon that's intrinsically tied into manufacturing stuff, okay? That's much harder to work at. Why is it hard to work at it? The more complex your manufacturing process, the more difficult it is to carbon account. There still isn't really a universally agreed method of saying how we decide how sustainable something is, okay? If you are manufacturing a product, you can look at how much carbon you emit in your, I was going to say everybody knows, perhaps most people know, some people might know about Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions and so on and so forth, they're all about how you link your carbon emissions to stages of your process, Scope 1 being inside the entire boundary of your plant. But the more complicated it is, the more difficult it is to see whether or demonstrate that you're making improvements. If I was to manufacture a solvent from a biological resource and then try and carbon map it against a solvent that Ineos make, it's very hard for me to prove to the government how much better the bio one is, which comes on to the second part, which is these are the things that governments don't incentivise. Part of it's because they don't know how, and part of it's because maybe there's significant pressure. I mean, if I was a Scottish government, I wouldn't want to get into a fight with Ineos particularly, but these are spaces that are difficult, very difficult to work with. And that then leads to a problem that it's hard to make major changes if you can't compete financially. Again, let's go back to the biosolvents. If I want to make a biosolvent and compete with Ineos, how do I do that financially? They have so much scale, they've been in the market for so long. Very difficult to do that without some sort of incentive to bring it into the space. Then we get to challenges around where you're looking at changing human nature. And as I said before, it's easier. This is not the space that I have any expertise in. We have colleagues over there who know far more about this kind of stuff than me. But it should be pretty obvious to all of us that if we're asked to make significant changes to our lifestyle, that's a harder pill to swallow than something that's relatively easy. And then we have to think about where it lies at odds with economic development. We can't, as a developed country, sit there and go, right, all the rest of you have to stop producing carbon dioxide because we got to develop our economy, but now you can't on the back of that. You have to do it a different way. I mean, we can do it, but we can't expect that that will automatically happen. And given that I'm going to talk particularly about the use of bioresource as a sustainability mitigation, there are some spaces where your options are constrained by necessity. Food is one of those. Yeah, we probably make too much food. We certainly throw away too much food, but you can't survive without it, and we've got a growing world population. So you can't turn around and go, right, okay, we're going to stop. This happened, you got any knowledge of the space, first generation of biofuels, and particularly the production of bioethanol from corn and maize. When you turn around, the US still does this, just diverts huge amounts of its corn and maize to making bioethanol. But that would be food. Okay, so if you do that, you have to think about how you manage a growing population when you do it. Okay, so a manufacturing process, right? This is a standard linear manufacturing process. This is how we traditionally have made stuff. We take raw materials, we take energy, we take water, we process it, we make products, we get byproducts and waste. There we go, okay. Traditionally, I told you this is going to be very simplistic. Traditionally, a lot of those raw materials come from fossil carbon or fossil sources, right? What we want is something that's much more like this, okay? Where we are using much less water and energy, recycling it, where we are using much less fossil carbon resource, and where we are taking our wastes and we're taking our byproducts and we are turning those back into other products, or we're taking them, repurposing them as raw materials. This has already been touched on already by previous speakers. Why is it so hard to do this? There's a number of reasons why it's hard to do this. This space here, this is one of the big challenges. There's lots and lots of work on energy efficiency, water saving, all this kind of thing. Although what I will say is, somebody that works a lot with the brewing and distilling industries in this space, the challenge is the variation, the difference in operation between Glenturret, which is a tiny distillery which produces 0.5 mLA, half a million litres of alcohol a year, compared to, I don't know, Cameron Bridge, which is Diageo's big grain distillery, in terms of the data they have that we can work with, the understanding they have of their processes. That makes it very, very challenging. The variation makes it difficult to work in these kind of spaces. But particularly in this sort of space, your byproducts and your wastes, they are not a key part of your manufacturing process. They are not a key part of your business model. So therefore, changes to that are quite difficult to get people to take on board. One of the biggest challenges we found as a company, we developed processes to work with the whiskey industry's raw byproducts. Okay? Investors are slightly suspicious of the idea that your business model relies on taking somebody else's waste or byproduct. If you were buying a raw material which can be traded on as a commodity market, they can send their analysts out to look at what the predicted value of that is and whether your business model stacks up in that space. If you're dealing with somebody's waste, it's very hard for them to do. So they kind of look at it and go, okay, all right. It's much harder to get money in these kind of spaces. So these things are not incredibly easy. The other problem you end up with is an idea whereby your business model might rely on somebody else's business model to work, which is critical for a circular economy approach, but that's difficult to sell to investors as well. So other regions are better at it. Nordic region is better at it. Benelux is better at it. We in the UK are not brilliant at this, but we need to get to this somehow. Right, even more simple. This is a really simple carbon cycle. I apologise to anybody that's involved in carbon cycle mapping or anything, because clearly this is rubbish, but there's a point to this, okay? One of my primary interests is the use of bioresource as a way of decarbonising, okay? But associated with protein, and it sounds weird, but the point here is, this is what we usually sort of do, right? We have a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere, a certain amount of carbon underground. What we are trying to do is avoid having more carbon underground in the atmosphere. Simple, except it's not, obviously. Carbon and nitrogen is taken from the atmosphere, it's taken in by plants. We use plants as food, either directly or indirectly. If it's fed to animals, we take the carbon and nitrogen, that's us, okay. Then we take carbon from underground and we make stuff with it. That wasn't specifically meant to be a camper van, it's just the best icon I could find. It's not meant to show fuel, it's just meant to show stuff. And we make stuff out of carbon, and we make a lot of our stuff out of carbon underground, right? What we could do and what we should do, it's caught me. is take the carbon from the bioresource, because the carbon from the bioresource has come out of the air, and if we make our stuff from that carbon, then we aren't taking carbon out from underground. You get it really right and you end up with carbon negative manufacturing processes, because if you can lock the carbon into the stuff and keep that in a recycling strategy, you're actually lowering the carbon in the atmosphere, right? But the problem is, if you do that traditionally, the way it's been currently done, you lose the nitrogen. And if you lose the nitrogen, you end up with dead Lego people, because you haven't got enough food. The carbon that comes into the food cycle is less important than the nitrogen, because the nitrogen is the protein, okay? So that's what happened to the first attempts at making biofuels. It just took food out of the equation, and you end up with a food versus fuel debate or a food versus stuff debate, and that doesn't really work. What you need to be able to do is to take the carbon and manufacture from it, but leave the nitrogen so that your Lego person stays happy. That's both, well, it's easy as a concept, but perhaps hard to develop in reality. But the way it's done is by ensuring that your bioresource is refined, is separated into its components of value. Oh, no, it's got me. I got nearly to the end. So close. Okay, so what we are trying to do here is we're trying to get to this sort of sustainable manufacturing process, and we're managing this, which is a hierarchy of value of stuff. And normally when we talk about hierarchy of value, the things at the top are the most important, but here the things at the top aren't the most important. What's the most important thing we do with nitrogen? Probably feed people, probably through protein. At its top end, you've got functional therapeutics, way back to the stuff that I was working with years and years ago and other things like that. But what we need to make sure is that we don't end up with the laser's not working now. Everything's broken. I'm giving up. No, it's not going to have it. We need to make sure that we end up with the carbon and the nitrogen being used in the sweet spots of the manufacturing chain, not at the bottom where they're worthless or at the top where it's too specific. Okay. And what we're trying to avoid is situations like this, which is what I've been talking about with the stuff we've been working with in the whiskey industry, okay? There's a tendency now to see, from food industries and things like that, to see byproducts and waste sent for anaerobic digestion. The reason being that that's a neat way of making biogas. But that wastes the nitrogen that's in the byproduct, because that just ends up in ammonia being vented to the atmosphere. So what you want to do is try and separate the nitrogen and the carbon so that you can get value out of both parts of it. So it's a simple case of separating protein and everything else, separating protein and carbohydrate apart from each other in these byproducts and wastes so that you can then get maximum value. That shows carbohydrate as biogas, question mark. The reason being right now that's about the best thing we do with waste biological carbohydrate. 5 years down the line, I would hope we're making bioplastic out of that, or we're making building block chemicals out of that as we make progress in these kind of scientific areas. You know, we've got research going on in our labs at the moment about making bioplastic out of salmon scales and all sorts of other stuff. Right? So I'll finish up with just some things, but also a couple of examples of stuff we work with. So we need to move from using underground carbon to overground carbon, bioresource carbon, to manufacture stuff, okay? But if we do that, we have to be massively mindful of the fact that we tend to use plant-based carbon as a source of nutrition. We don't need the carbon to be a source of nutrition, but the plant-based nitrogen we definitely do need to be a source of nutrition. To get there, that means we need to embrace this concept of biorefining of natural resources, or wastes, but natural biological waste and resource particularly. So separation out of components of value and then using them in that way. And that involves a change in mindset about how we do manufacturing, about how we invest in stuff, because it does involve collaborative technologies working together. But we have to be pragmatic about the fact that we are expecting we'd be trying to force some significant societal changes onto people, and that's not an easy thing to do. Now, just for the sake of there actually being some science in this, and not that I just stand here and waffle stuff all the time. Just a couple of examples of some things we've done. That at the top is a protein powder that is manufactured from a liquid byproduct of malt whisky production in Scotland. Malt whisky, seen as a lovely sort of cottage artisanal industry in Scotland, it's absolutely massive. Okay? Malt whisky industry in Scotland throws away 3 billion litres a year of something called pot ale, which is a liquid, but doesn't always throw it away, to be fair, just use it for other things, which is a liquid byproduct. If you took that protein out of, took all the protein out of, easily accessible protein out of the pot ale that we can recover, that's about 15,000 tonnes of protein a year. That's really high grade, really soluble, really nutritional protein, which can be used in human food as well as animal feed. Okay? And that's just from something that costs the whisky industry to deal with right now. That's an example of the kind of things you need to do. The bottom one is slightly more morally questionable. That's an Aston Martin 177. It's not anybody's mind an idea of sustainable consumption. I think the last time I saw one of those for sale, it was about 1.5 million quid. The reason it's in there is that we've been working for the last couple of years with Scottish Leather Group. And Scottish Leather Group make the leather for Aston Martins, amongst other. Actually, pretty much any car that's not either French or German, the leather is made by Scottish Leather Group. Now, you can have all sorts of sustainability debates you like about whether or not you should be making car seats out of leather. There are actually some pretty good sustainability papers in either direction about the sustainability of leather versus non-animal products. But pragmatically, if you do, you need to make the best use of the waste from it. So we work with Scottish Leather Group to recover waste protein, which has highly functional properties. They're now using waste protein from the leather process with Aston Martin to make the foam that's inside Aston Martin seats, which otherwise would have definitely come from dead dinosaurs. So it's a small thing, but it's improving the sustainability of a process as it exists, which is an easier thing to do than making a fundamental change. So I think with that, that's me pretty much done. So I think you now get to shout at all of us.
Thanks very much, Nick. I was going to praise him for his dexterous and soft-fingered use of the clicker before it all went sadly wrong.
So close.
We've got limited time here. There is a microphone. If you want to ask any questions, stick your hand up. We're going to do a few quick-fire questions first of all. They're all very complicated, but we're going to ask for short answers. Marylyn, the St Ives example that you used. I've just come back from holiday in Portugal where they've got a tourist tax in Porto and Lisbon. Have you looked at tourist taxes and whether they play a part in a reduction in people travelling to certain places, or is that irrelevant because they'll just go somewhere else?
No, I think it is irrelevant, and I haven't looked at it. I mean, that's kind of like probably the tourism people have been focusing on that, which probably have some of them in the room. But I think, it's something St Ives as a town has done. I mean, they're already been focusing on things like not allowing people to buy second homes, which is one of the things that they do. And I think, it's part of that difficult decision. I mean, we have to transition, we have to change. And I know one of the things you wanted to highlight is how difficult that is for people, particularly who are on, sort of less income, who, struggle with some of the sustainability requests that are made of them. But I think something like this, that's a policy argument, and I think we have to make them. It's a bit like, a few years back, we did a paper on Modbury, which was the very first plastic bag-free town. And everyone kind of, moaned and whined about that, and we're all kind of getting on with it now. I saw in the news this week, Killarney in Ireland had become the first single-use plastic cup-free town. Now, people in Oban, that we did the research where I work, still struggling with this, but you can make these kind of policy decisions which feel a little bit uncomfortable, a bit like, not allowing smoking inside, but over time, some of these things actually become very accepted. So I think something like that is a reality. And I say that, and I think it's really important I say this, I am going to St Ives on my holidays next year. So, I'm as bad as anyone else, and it's a really difficult decision. And I link this back to this idea of where we make our decisions. And I would never judge other people and decisions they make, because I know I make decisions, that would look very uncomfortable as a professor of sustainability, but that's the reality. And I think what we have to do is understand, using the research that we do, where we can help people to make those changes in their life, but where we need them to make the changes, that's the role for policy, to say, actually, I know this feels uncomfortable, but we're going to have to do it.
And you used Vivienne Westwood there at the end of your slides. should I encourage my 3 daughters to be selling their old clothes on Vinted and sites like this? And what's the message? And are you seeing a generational shift in consuming less?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, I've got a daughter, she's 23 years old, and there's no, she doesn't consume anything like I do. And there's been a shift in understanding, although I think it's a cultural shift, and you have to think about this. So we've got Lisa here, and we've got student Gigi, who's down at Galashiels. We share a PhD student. And she's been looking at people's attitudes to this. And so she found that, for example, the European students that she was talking to were very keen on vintage clothes and second-hand and selling on. But when she spoke to the Chinese students, her contemporaries, they were like, oh, no, thank you. Wouldn't buy second-hand. There's a kind of like social stigma to that, and they're not very interested. So some of these solutions, as we said, will be very much depending on the culture and very much dependent on, the context. But I think generationally, people are waking up to the idea that we've been over-consuming, and certainly that generation with fast fashion, although they're still very hooked into it, there is movement against that,
Okay, thank you. Ed, can you give us an example in the supply chain where we've gone from excessive complexity to relative simplicity? And if you can make your answer relatively simple, please.
Whoa. I think there are so many examples, really, but I just wanted to give a shout out to a piece of work I've been doing with Amazon up in Dunfermline. And this is work which was sponsored and supported by the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. And what was happening in that Amazon supply chain was a lot of the returns were going to landfill and going for incineration. And meanwhile, in that particular part of Fife, we have some of the highest rates of child poverty, for example, of anywhere in the UK. So what we did was we came together, found a beneficiary charity in Kirkcaldy, worked with the Amazon people, designed a really simple supply chain, which was taking the unwanted surplus stock from the fulfillment centre in Dunfermline and distributing it to beneficiary charities via a hub in Lough Ely. So I wanted to use that example because to me, it's a really good example of circular economy in action, because it's about economic and social as well as environmental sustainability. And the reason it works is because the supply chain is so simple. One of the reasons that there is so much surplus stock in that distribution centre is because the supply chain that deals with the reverse stuff, the return stuff, is too complex. So I think that in one example gives us a good illustration of where simplicity works and where complexity leads to waste and problems.
Okay, great. Any questions? Yep. Question over here. Just shout. Go on. Quick question and shout loud. Yeah.
Okay, I could answer that.
Yeah, Marylyn, then Nick, maybe about manufacturing a little bit. Do you want to throw a bit in?
So, 2 consumer examples. Gigi, a wonderful PhD student in Galashiels, is currently working on designing an app to help people manage their wardrobe so that they are going to buy less stuff because they'll be enchanted with what they've got already. But a really interesting example that's just come out, I was interviewing yesterday someone from Keep Scotland Beautiful who are working with us. They've just had the North Coast 500 reusable cup deposit scheme. And we were asking them what were the things that didn't work, because we had the scheme in Oban and we know what didn't work there. And she said the thing that people are really reluctant to do was use the app. They didn't want the app. They hated the app. So although they were really keen on the deposit scheme, they weren't keen on putting the app on their phone. And we were all really surprised by that. So he said they're all fed up, there's so many apps, they're so fed up having them on the phone. They're actually quite concerned that they're causing problems with their phone. So they were actually rejecting the digitalisation, which was great for collecting data, but not something that the consumers were very happy with.
We're really tight for time. Sorry, there's quite a lot of other areas I'd like to cover. Sorry, apologies for butting in. But Nick, I'd like to ask you something different. You mentioned Ineos early on, and you said, how can a small company possibly compete with the scale of Ineos? How do governments and policymakers encourage people like Ineos to do more of the right thing?
So I'm not sure that there is a way for them to just go to big company. I'm not throwing Ineos out there like they are definitely the somehow evil or anything like that. We can get into that's another debate we can get into if you want, but the challenge that governments and policymakers have to face particularly is they have a significant issue with unintended consequences when they start interfering with all this kind of stuff. I briefly mentioned one thing up there about the split between carbon and nitrogen in byproducts and going to digesters and stuff like that. The reason that a lot of food waste and byproducts from processes go to anaerobic digesters is because the Scottish and UK governments incentivise it through the Green Gas Certificate scheme and through renewable energy obligations. But the problem with that is that when you lose the protein in that space as well, you have to fill that protein hole. And with one of the byproducts from the whisky industry, most of that used to go to cattle feed. And now it goes to digesters. So what happens is the agriculture industry imports protein, usually soy from South America. And in something that will probably surprise none of you, the carbon footprint of bringing soy in from South America is higher than the carbon saving in making biogas. So it's actually worse for Scotland, but better for one sector of the industry.
And something else we talked about was whether governments are too guilty in picking winners, in picking certain technologies that are maybe the flavour of the month. And is that another, unintended consequence of policy making, that they go one way and they leave lots more untouched?
I think it's very difficult for governments and policymakers because they are frequently faced with people that will come along and go, this technology is brilliant, this technology is brilliant, this technology, and eventually somebody will shout loud enough and that technology will be backed. And once it's backed, it's difficult to then unback something. I mean, we see how difficult particularly these incentive spaces. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it brought down the government in Stormont. So the fact that how this was done is problematic. But yeah, I wish there was an easy solution to this. But yeah, we need to find better ways of understanding whole processes. I guess it comes into the supply chain stuff and not just focusing in on one narrow space.
Yeah, I'll come to the audience for another question in a minute. Ed, first of all, at Labour conference recently, Rachel Reeves talked about secureonomics, and he's taught, does that, what I understand what she was saying does include a lot more domestic production and domestic supply chains. Are you encouraged that that's being talked about? And do politicians care about those supply chains enough? And where you're raising your eyebrows quite a bit here, so yeah, go on. I'll hand it over.
Well, I'm raising my eyebrows because I'm conscious that I need to be slightly careful in my response. Let me respond in two ways. First of all, I find it really encouraging that logistics and supply chain issues are on the political agenda now. That happened in this country largely as a consequence of the Brexit referendum, which we began to realise very quickly was largely about issues concerned with trade flows, with movement of stuff across international borders. And during the pandemic, again, our subject area became front and centre of political discourse and media coverage for the first time ever, really. Now, I think that has given us an opportunity to educate people, if you will, in terms of what the whole supply chain is about. But the thing I did want to say was that the vast on the vast majority of occasions, supply chains are invisible to us, and they only become visible when things go wrong. And that's a kind of sad part of life. So if we see empty shelves in a supermarket, for the first time you begin to think, well, how did that happen? And then you begin to think about Brexit restrictions, and you begin to think about driver shortages and so on. So in a sense, the media discourse and political discourse has happened sometimes for bad reasons, but it's given us an opportunity to shed some light on some of these complex issues.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here. Any other questions after that? Yeah, one question there, then one at the back. Yep.
Does it though? I mean, if you think back to your granny, who used to be really frugal with the things she did. I mean, I'm sitting here and I've got my Doc Martens on. They're 15 years old and they were resold by Timson's a few weeks ago. my granny always used to do that with her shoes. She always used to mend stuff and make it last. And I think we've kind of, the kind of encouragement to consume that kind of went on in the sort of 60s and 70s and 80s, we lost touch with that. So I think it's more about relearning the ways we used to behave around goods. I don't think you need to be too informed. And I think one of the sad things that's happened is the cost of living crisis. But I think it actually has had one positive spin, is that it's focused our minds on, you know, how wasteful we are and how we have to maybe kind of make things last that we have rather than just keep consuming. So I think even if you do it from an economic motivation rather than a sustainable motivation, the idea that you buy better, you know, doesn't really require huge amounts of ethical literacy, would be my response.
Okay, thank you. I'll take one last question over here, please. If you stand up and shout, please.
Thank you. Yeah, let me
Don't ask me, I'm the
Yeah,
least
I mean,
AI.
I'm happy to.
Yeah.
I mean, what concerns me slightly about the debate on AI, and Luciana, we talked about this, didn't we, at the launch of the IAS lab recently, is that, you know, we've got lots and lots of different technology platforms and technology solutions, all of which have the potential to help us, but no single one of which will ever be a panacea or a magic solution. And I think there's far too much of this sort of silver bullet approach. You know, we find one magic technology that somehow is going to revolutionize our supply chains and solve all of our problems. And I'm afraid life isn't as simple as that. I mean, the other thing we've tended to do in supply chains is we've tended to automate bad processes. You remember what we talked about? I mean, what do you get? A slightly faster bad process, you know, and maybe a slightly less sustainable process as a consequence. So I think we need to be circumspect about this, and we need to be holistic. And going back to what Nick said, we need to be aware of the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah. And to add to that as well, I think coming back to something I said about just the whiskey industry as an example, we need to be aware of the limitations of availability of data in this kind of space. That's one of the challenges we find with trying to work with such a broad industry and how it operates, in terms of, I can't just go in and go, right, you know this and you know that and you know the other, so therefore what we can do is reduce your energy by 30% by, we'll do a pinch analysis on this and we'll put a heat exchanger there, sorry. Boring chemical engineering crap, but we can't do that if the distillery has too little information about that. It's just not possible. So the ability to deploy these tools is heavily dependent on the amount of data you've got. What we really would like to work on is how we develop digital techniques which can work with massively variable amounts of data. It's not my skill set at all. So.
And imperfect data.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
AI does.
Yeah.
Good luck convincing a master distiller to use AI, I would suggest.
I'm very conscious. I'm conscious of time. I'm also conscious of the huge complexity here and the big challenges. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to ask each speaker from Nick along just to come up with one really positive takeaway for the people sitting here today about the work that you're doing around sustainability and circular economy. Give us something to be optimistic and positive about. Nick, Ed, then Marylyn.
Okay, so I would say, and I won't use the whole anecdote we did when we discussed this before because it came across as negative. We often look at stuff like this about solving things like this as being too hard. It's not too hard. We just need time or resource, and we haven't really got time. So what we need is resource. So given that, find the resource to solve these kind of problems, and they can be solved.
Ed?
And we weren't, by the way, warned about this question in advance. I mean, my one-word response to your question is it's about people. And I think as educators, we have a serious responsibility in terms of equipping our students with the skills and knowledge and competencies that will be absolutely essential if we're going to make some of this change happen. So I think change is a given. We can't continue. Standing still equals falling behind, if you like. So we've got to change, and that change is going to be dependent most of all on people. So we've got to get that bit right.
Okay, Marylyn, final word.
Yeah, I would just say that a lot of the time sustainability and ethical behaviours couched in terms of it's very expensive and unaffordable, and actually, and you know, how do we make a difference to the world? And I think my my attitude is that every individual thing we do collectively has massive impact, and we can all make small changes, whether that's eating less meat, carrying your water bottle, not using a single-use cup, you know, wearing your stuff again, take it to the menders, take it to get it, you know, altered if it's got too small or got too big or isn't fashionable. These are really small things we can do, but collectively that has a massive impact globally.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to say thanks to all our three speakers. Conscious that there's so many more questions and that people here are coming from very different perspectives at it, but you know, they are very diverse contributions, but they are very complementary in terms of the way we're all heading. So I think hopefully all three are staying around afterwards, so if you have got questions you can go and ask them face to face and carry on the conversation. But to finish us off today, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. Can I hand over to Professor Igor Gutz, who is Executive Dean for the School of Engineering and Physical Sciences, just to say a final few words, and while he comes forward, just thank the panel, please.